From devastating floods and worsening droughts to growing concerns over food security and the future of the planet's water systems, our impact on the environment is disrupting the foundations of everyday life. Coming up, the vulnerable countries still struggling to recover from repeated climate disasters.
The reality is that the current financial response from the developed countries is little more than an empty promise.
To a global water cycle under pressure.
Every single drop of water that you use, whether it's a farmer or an urban resident, it comes from somewhere.
And food systems becoming increasingly fragile, particularly during times of conflict.
When peace is not there, food security is not there.
As climate pressures grow, the question is no longer whether these crises are connected, but how prepared we are for what comes next. Just 2 degrees is on. Now,
Donald Trump famously withdrew from UN organizations in terms of funding them. Has that been like a real problem for IFAD?
images like these rarely dominate the headlines, and when they do, they're often overshadowed by politics and conflicts. In China, violent winds tore through densely populated areas without warning. In Thailand, extreme gusts sent debris flying through city streets. And in India, sudden storms and heavy winds ripped roofs off buildings.
Fortunately, in these cases, many people manage to escape serious harm, but climate disasters don't always give people time to find safety.
In Guangxi, China, tourists were paddleboarding along a river when the weather suddenly turned violent. Their guide became separated from the rest of the group as strong winds whipped across the water. Meanwhile, in Somalia's capital, Mogadishu, rains and floods submerged low-lying neighborhoods. After years of drought and a rapid urban expansion, the country's become increasingly vulnerable to extreme weather shocks.
But once the floodwaters recede or the storms pass, how do people rebuild? And what happens to countries that simply cannot afford to recover from one climate disaster after another after another? Well, that question sits at the heart of the Loss and Damage Fund, which is a global mechanism designed to help vulnerable nations respond to the destruction caused by the crisis.
The fund was formally operationalized at COP28 in Dubai. It followed from years of pressure from developing nations who argue that those least responsible for climate change are often suffering its worst consequences. But despite the political breakthrough, major questions remain.
Make the polluters pay now!
So now we have a loss and damage fund that's, well, technically operational, but with only a few $100 million available compared to hundreds of billions that are needed. Where do we really stand right now?
Reagan, thank you very much for having me and raising this very important issue. And yes, as you know, we fought for more than 3 decades to get this fund up and running. And on the one hand, we see that a lot of policies are being put in place, but the reality is that the current financial response from the developed countries is little more than an empty promise. The scale of the climate crisis is really intense. If you look at some of the estimates, they range from $395 billion annually to over $700 billion annually in developing countries alone. And imagine how much money that has been committed so far is barely $822 million. And the amount of money that has been received is close to $450 million. So it's less than 0.1% of the annual requirement. That's the money currently the fund has. So reality is not really matching with the kind of money that is available with the fund right now. And that's the biggest concern that we have.
And the same question keeps arising, right? There's still no decision on who should be contributing to this fund, whether it's traditional donors, fossil fuel companies, emerging economies. How is that shaping the future of the fund?
So this year, in fact, we are late by 1 year. we are supposed to finalize the resource mobilization strategy to answer exactly the kind of questions that you touched upon, Reagan. And it's important. First of all, we all know that the primary responsibility lies with the developed world. They are the ones who are responsible for putting most greenhouse gases in the atmosphere cumulatively. So they have to take a lead in providing finance. But we know the scale of money that is required, which is in hundreds of billions of dollars annually. We also need to look at how we can see some of the so-called innovative sources. What does that mean? It means putting a tax on the fossil fuel extraction, which means we need to punish the fossil fuel industry, which is responsible for the climate crisis. We also need to look at sources like putting levy on air travel, putting levy on financial transaction tax. And there are various estimates that you can raise hundreds of billions of dollars if you really want to. If I talk about climate damages tax, if you put barely $5 per ton of tax, you could raise close to $50 billion in the first year alone. For the fund itself. If you tax the ultra rich, you can raise billions of dollars. So the money is available. It's about the political will that developed countries need to show to start taxing, one, who are responsible for the crisis, and second, who are even profiting from it.
That political will keeps popping up. So for countries already facing climate disasters today, does this fund in its current form, Harjeet, make any difference to those countries whatsoever?
Well, absolutely. If you look at the potential of the loss and damage fund, it's massive. And that's how the mandate has been established. This fund is supposed to provide money to communities and countries who are facing a situation of what we call lost development, which means that they already had those resources, whether we talk about lost infrastructure, loss of livelihoods, or even loss of lives. So developed countries are not doing any favor. It's not a charity. It's not about development. Developing countries had that. Now we see these climate impacts eroding the development. So this fund goes beyond adaptation. And that's a very important distinction that we always underline. And as I said, the needs are from $400 billion to $700 billion annually in developing countries alone. This fund should channel bulk of the money that is required by developing countries. They are facing extreme heat waves, floods, droughts. They are also facing wildfires. And we see how people are getting displaced. They are forced out of their homes. Their livelihoods are being destroyed. Their homes are being washed away. They need resources to rebuild their lives. And what we are calling for is direct access, which is something very different from the existing funds, which means money should not go to the intermediaries. Money should go to governments directly and with a process that they don't have to write long proposals. But unfortunately, I must tell you, the pilot phase that is going on right now, where the fund has set aside $250 million, is following the same process of asking for funding requests, which is going to take months, and then the assessment of those proposals is going to take months. That's not what the mandate is. And that's why we are putting pressure on the fund, both on the board and the secretariat, to make sure that it is actually an emergency response fund, but also supports long-term rehabilitation and reconstruction work. So this fund is absolutely needed to support developing countries who see their scarce resources going into relief and rehabilitation than for development or for adaptation.
As you know, Harjeet, COP31 is going to happen here in Turkey later on this year. So the president-designate, Murat Kurum, says he'll prioritize the issue of climate finance, including the loss and damage fund at the conference. Do you have confidence Turkey can truly drive this conversation to have real results on this topic?
Well, if we really want these climate summits to succeed, we have to bring in back the confidence in these processes, where we have seen developed countries only putting pressure on the developing world to do more on emission reduction. Yes, that is required, but the fact is you have not provided money. And if you look at on paper, the commitments developing countries have made, they're far more ambitious than the developed world, which is in fact pretty busy going for more fossil fuels, the core cause of the climate crisis, whereas developing countries who have shown the willingness to go more and more for renewable energy, they're not getting climate finance. So climate finance is absolutely central to increasing our ambitious climate action, but also to bring back the credibility that is getting lost when we talk about these climate summits. So we have very specific demand from the loss and damage perspective. Next year, there's going to be the first resource mobilization cycle or replenishment cycle, as we call it. So we demand at least $50 billion annually starting 2027 until 2030. Then it has to be raised to $100 billion annually by 2031, and it goes until 2034. And then $400 billion annually by 2035 to match the evolving scale of the crisis. That's the kind of money that is required. So we are already providing that ladder of how we raise money, and it is good that the president designate of Turkey is actually looking at climate finance, because that's what is going to rebuild trust and really tell the world that the international cooperation and the multilateral process is still working for the poorest and most vulnerable who are not responsible for the climate crisis.
As climate disasters become more frequent, more destructive, you've got to wonder how countries recover when the systems that sustain life are beginning to break down. That question sits at the center of discussions around the Loss and Damage Fund, as Harjeet just mentioned, particularly for vulnerable nations that face repeated floods and droughts. But according to a new report by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the challenge goes even deeper than rebuilding after disasters, and argues that we may now be disrupting the global water cycle itself. Most people think of water as something that comes out of a tap, but your report argues the entire water cycle is, well, infrastructure. Can you just elaborate on that?
Thank you very much. So the water cycle moves billions of cubic meters of water to the atmosphere, to the rivers, to the aquifers, and so on. So indeed, every single drop of water that you use, whether it's a farmer or an urban resident, it comes from somewhere. And it takes the whole ecosystem to move this huge volume of water. And without this ecosystem to support this massive water movement, a lot of our daily infrastructure will cease to function well. Let me give you a very simple example. In places whereby it is very dry and the rain doesn't fall, no matter how much canals you build, the irrigation infrastructure will not be productive. It will not work because simply the water is not going to be there. So in order for our human infrastructure to work, we desperately need to also preserve and conserve the natural ecosystem so that the water can be there in the first place. This is what the report is trying to say. The engineered infrastructure and the nature infrastructure needs to work together.
So if the global water cycle is breaking down, as you're suggesting, then what are the first signs that ordinary people are already experiencing, even if they don't realize it as yet?
So the farmers will feel the impact of climate change through droughts. When the rain stops coming, the land becomes dry, too hot, the land can no longer hold water. That is how the farmers will feel the impact of water. Some cities are also running dry because of the lower reservoirs, lowered aquifers. Cities are sinking. We see reports of Mexico City sinking, and even the satellite can detect it. Some people may also feel the impact of a changed water cycle through flooding. In some coastal areas, too much water is coming in because the air is too humid. Too much water is coming down because of the moisture, and the seawater is rising. So maybe you do not yet feel it on a day-to-day basis, but people, whether it's farmers, urban residents, they are increasingly hit with this kind of water-related shocks. And more, these risks are becoming visible.
One of the most fascinating ideas in the report is that forests can influence rainfall thousands of kilometers away. It sort of shows how interconnected the planet really is. When many people, particularly in the global north, don't see global south disasters as something that can potentially reach them.
That is one of the most fascinating aspects of the report, the research coming out. To be frank, we are not the only first people to say this, but we have done in a lot more details through the data work. 3 critical areas, the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and also the Indonesian forest, supply the world with lots of hydrology, lots of water. And the forests are key to pumping this water inland through the evaporation, taking the water from the ground, evaporation, and then sending the water elsewhere. It really goes to show how interconnected the planet is and how transboundary the water system is. It also gives AIIB, multilateral development banks, the motivation to want to invest in the conservations, not only in Asia, but in the different regions as well. We really want to work with policymakers and governments to preserve and conserve these forests, these wetlands, etc., as natural infrastructure.
During our chat, you've really stressed how fragile the water system is. What worries you most if we continue treating the water cycle as an infinite resource instead of the fragile system it seems to be?
The risks are tremendous. So in one of the chapters that we did in the report, we showed that lower income economies, every time the water stress goes up, is associated with a reduction in the risk rating. Because water is a factor of inputs, a factor of production, it really affects the economy very much. Why are the lower income economies more affected? Because there's a larger agriculture sector, which is more dependent on water. Every time the water cycle breaks down, every time there's drought, it affects the agriculture sector more, and by extension, it means affecting the lower income economies more. If you're a rich country, you can afford the electricity or the energy to do desalination. It's going to be expensive, but maybe you can afford it. But for the low income countries and for the environment, desalination is often not the option, right? So when the water cycle breaks down, the poor people get affected the most. I would like to highlight that the water risk is a food risk, is also an economic risk for most parts of the world. And that linkages, that clarity of thinking must come true. Water security is food security, is economic security.
That's an important point, Dr. Ping, that the water risk is also a food risk and an economic risk. Thanks for the chat. So climate shocks are placing incredible pressure on global food systems at a time of geopolitical uncertainty and economic strain. According to the United Nations, hundreds of millions of people around the world continue to face food insecurity, with rural communities often hit the hardest. And that's where the International Fund for Agricultural Development says investment in rural economies and small-scale farmers is becoming increasingly critical, not just for food production, but for global stability itself. Vice President Mukeshimana, there's so much happening in the world right now. DRC, conflicts in Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine, Iran. It feels as though food security isn't a real priority right now, even though wars exacerbate our lack of food.
Yeah, it's an interesting view because when crises take place, they capture the whole news. But when peace is building, no one speak about it. So I think what is important is to recognize also the peace, the quiet peace builders. So IFAD is one of them because we invest in rural development, we invest in rural communities' resilience vis-a-vis conflicts, climate change, economic crisis. So all of that, we are the peace builder has that because when peace is not there, food security is not there. When food security is not there, peace is not there. So these are the things that work together, and it's really important that the food security comes back to the front seat because when we see what is happening globally, they are accompanied by food insecurity. So when the rural communities are not really shielded against the shocks, that's where we see a lot of local insecurity. That's where we see a lot of people migrating, leaving their homes. And I don't assume that anyone is happy to leave their communities and their homes. They are really moving because there is no support to make them to stay there.
They leave their homes, they're also leaving their farms. If IFAD is helping a farmer develop their local ground, what happens when that farmer is forced to migrate because of different reasons, conflict, the climate crisis? How does IFAD play a role in that farmer's now relocation from the farm you helped that farmer develop?
So again, the stability doesn't get built in one day. So IFAD comes into preventing the relocation. So we work with the communities, we work with the governments. Actually, IFAD is the financing of governments so that the governments can invest into rural stability. And our job is to make sure that we are building that. When they are relocating, sometimes we have short-term systems that we can trigger so that we can be able to support that immediately. But our niche is a long-term livelihoods, long-term stability, and that we specialize into that.
Speaking of support, I believe it was in February, you launched IFAD 14, which is a drive for more funding to do the good work that you're doing. But what are the main challenges for you, and what happens if you don't get the funding that you require?
So in IFAD 14, we are looking again at building local resilience. We are looking at building market systems. We are looking at creating jobs for young people. And we are looking at more innovation and private sector investments. So we have targets on resources that we want to mobilize because, again, IFAD has 180 member states.
Donald Trump famously withdrew from UN organizations in terms of funding them. Has that been like a real problem for IFAD?
Actually, we have the commitments of the US is coming because in the previous law that he had signed, the IFAD pledge is also built into that. So the U.S. has been really a reliable partner to IFAD, and our partnership continues to be strong.
Exactly how much money is IFAD looking, or rather need, to fund its next cycle? And do you expect to reach that target?
We are looking, as I mentioned, we mobilize resources for our member states. We are looking close to 1.8 billion, and for that we can top it up with the deflows of previous loans and also the capital market mobilization. So for now we have a portfolio for 3.4 billion that from this cycle, but the ongoing portfolio is about 23 billion. So we really look at increasing that, because now is the time that the food production comes back. It's important that the global food systems, even the local food systems, function. Actually, what is needed now the most is sustainable and stable local food systems so that communities can be able to thrive, and then we can look into other things later.
Vice President Mukeshimana, thank you so much for your time. And that's our show. Whether it's the struggle to recover from climate disasters, or the growing pressure on the global water cycle, or even the future of agriculture and food security, there are no longer distant environmental issues affecting someone else, somewhere else. These crises are deeply connected, and ignoring them could affect all of us sooner than we think. Until next time, bye.